Hey everybody, thanks for clicking on this video. What I would like to do in this video is two things. First, I would like to give you some advice around reading as an activity. Specifically, we'll be talking about reading literature, but the advice that I'm going to give, I think, is good for any kind of situation where you need to do deep focus reading. The second thing that I want to do is I want to pick a text from our literary anthology and annotate it in real time with you so that you can see how I would go about doing that sort of thing. That might feel a little bit like overkill or maybe a little too much, but I tend to find that people tend to respond well when they see something done in an example form. Over the years that I have been teaching literature courses, I've heard more and more students tell me that it's getting harder and harder to read. I don't think the texts themselves are getting harder. I think what we have on our hands is a media environment and a technological environment that is pushing a kind of hyperactivity, a kind of moving from one thing to the next thing as fast as possible, a culture that has fetishized efficiency, a culture that has let smartphone usage become so widespread and prevalent that people turn to their phones in times of boredom. They turn to their phones in times of uh, uh, downtime and are getting a lot of mental and cognitive engagement with short form bursts of things. As a result, I think it's getting harder to read longer forms of writing. But I want to say up front that there's really good news on this front. And this is something that my wife, who is a therapist, talks about a lot with our kids and with our friends and anybody for whom, the subject comes up and she's part of the conversation. The good news is you can get it back. The brain is a marvel of plasticity. And what that means is as you become, as you build habits, your brain will strengthen to work with those habits. And when people say things like it's harder to read or it's bad, I can't read something long or I have trouble with boring things, it is often a response of the fact that reading is a complex thing. And if you are out of the habit of doing that complex thing, it's getting harder and harder to do. And this is not just an age gap issue. This isn't just a educational divide issue. I have colleagues in the English department who would tell you that it's getting harder and harder for them to read because they aren't immune to the draw of the smartphone. And I've gone through periods myself where it's gotten harder and harder to focus and read, right? But the great news is you can reclaim this ability to focus on something like reading if you would like to work to reclaim it. And I want to give you some advice on how to do that. So I have five pieces of general advice, and I have four pieces of advice for this class. So a total of nine pieces of advice that I'm going to give you. My first piece of advice, when it comes just in general to reading, is read. And I know that that sounds probably, you know, tautological or it sounds like I'm being overly simplistic, but the short answer or the short explanation for why I give this piece of general advice is the habit builds. You're not going to get stronger. Reading's not going to become more natural unless you are engaging in the habit on a regular basis. This does not mean that you have to read for 8 hours a day. The brain really can't handle that level of work. But what that does mean is you have to do it with more regularity. Often I'll have students say things like the text that we read at the end of a course is easier to read than the text that we read at the start of the course. And often there's a confusion because the course tends to move chronologically. And so in a course like this, American literature, where we're getting up to the Civil War, sometimes what people will say things like, well, that's closer to quote unquote modern writing, therefore it's easier to read. I think people have that backwards. Or they're not looking at it through exactly the right lens. And the right lens, I think, would be this. Over the course of reading a lot, by the time you've gotten to the end of the course, it's become easier to read deeply. It has really nothing to do with the start of the course. Although some of the works that we read at the start of the course are a little challenging, and I'm not going to deny that, it's mostly a reflection of the fact that you've been reading for the length of the course. Then you get to the end of the course and you've started to build up that habit. The second thing that I want to say is attitude matters. And maybe attitude matters is also going to be good advice for this class to get us up to like around 10 pieces of advice. But attitude matters. If you say, I am somebody who can't read, I'm not a good reader, I can't focus when I read, I can't read books, I don't understand what I read, you create a self-fulfilling prophecy. You create mental and cognitive barriers that prevent you from pushing past that. You have to have an open-minded attitude, thinking to yourself, I want to become a more regular reader. I want to become a deeper reader of literature. If you say up front that you want to do that, then you build toward a goal of achieving that level. But if you say, I know I need to do this and I don't want to do it, you've created a self-fulfilling prophecy where every time you sit down to do it, you're going to resent the fact that you have to sit down to do it, which is going to serve as more of a distraction in your brain, which is going to keep you from engaging, which is going to keep you from building the habit. The third thing that I want to say is that you have to ease yourself in. Literature is different reading. Well, I think one of the great paradoxes of this, constant screen world that we have is we're reading sometimes so much more than we ever have in the past, because we're always looking at devices, always reading things that come across, reading things on social media, reading responses, reading comments, reading texts, reading emails, reading news. We're really actively engaged in the things that we're reading. Literature is a different thing, and you have to ease yourself in. You can't go from I haven't read at all to I'm going to sit down and read Moby Dick. It's just not going to happen. You're not going to be able to do that and have much success. So you have to ease in and give yourself an opportunity to just start to build the habit a little bit at a time. I saw a recommendation once that said, if you have really all the time that you could sit down and actually focus on reading, you want to start with something like 15 or 20 minutes a day and do that for a week and then bump it up by 5 minutes a day and then bump it up by 5 minutes a day and then bump it up by 5 minutes a day. And when you start to get to something like 40, 45 minutes, an hour of reading a day, when you really start to get to that point, then all of a sudden I think you'll discover that the habit has really started to build and it's getting easier and easier to do it. My fourth piece of advice is to track your reading. This doesn't mean that you have to keep a big running list of all the things that you were reading. Uh, Certainly not. But it does help to track what you read, because it helps with establishing habits. It gets to a point where you feel a sense of accomplishment. It helps build that attitude. It helps you move from one thing to the next thing. And so even if it's just a scrap piece of paper, even if it's just an app, a notes app on your phone where you're keeping track of the things that you're reading, even if you're printing the syllabus for a class like this and checking things off as you go through them, build a sense of momentum. There's a great piece of advice on habit building, which is you want to do it every single day. And when you do it every single day, you give yourself a little check. And then soon it becomes about not breaking the chain. I'm going to do this thing to keep the chain going because I've hit so many days in a row and I want to keep the chain going. That is also something that can help with habit building. The final piece of advice that I have for you is probably the piece of advice that maybe you know more intuitively, but maybe you don't want me to say, which is reduce your time on this thing. If you want to become a deeper reader, you need to reduce the time that you're spending looking at things that are not cognitively intense or cognitively complex or cognitively sophisticated or cognitively demanding. Now, sometimes when I give this advice to students, they say, well, I have a really busy life, um, and, you know, I just don't have time to read. I think the very first thing that you want to ask yourself is, what then is your screen time usage when it comes to your phone? How many hours a day are you clocking on various apps? How many hours a day are you clocking just hopping around on email, on whatever, right? If I'm talking about reading for 30 minutes a day and you're clocking in 3 hours on a social media app, um, there is time in the day to read, right? And it doesn't even mean that you have to give it up completely. Although something that is continuing to be short bursts, something that is continuing to pump dopamine into the brain because it's constantly new and novel entertainment and it's scrolling past as fast as it goes. That is a different cognitive experience than sitting with a book. And it's going to make sitting with a book a little harder because there's going to now be tension between those two things of the brain. Those are my 5 pieces of advice for becoming stronger readers, just in general, right? Whether you're reading literature or whether you're reading textbooks for school or whether you're studying for exams, right? Those are 5 pieces of general advice. Now, for this class, I'm going to also offer definitely 4 pieces of advice, but I'm going to add in a bonus fifth, and it also has to do with attitude, but it's going to repeat that piece of advice and it's going to twist it a little bit. So, success for reading in this class, right? On average, you're reading about 75 pages from our literary anthology each week. Some weeks are less than 75, some are a little more than 75, but 75 is the average. I went through and counted all of the pages that you're reading each week and then added them all up and then averaged them across the weeks to get a number. And I think it was like 74.8 or something like that. So it's about 75 pages a week that you're reading. That's actually kind of on the low side for a course like this, a 200 level literary course that's covering American literature from the beginnings through 1865. But there are certain, limitations that have to be put into place for an accelerated um, 8 week course like the ones that Ivy Tech now has as 90 some percent, 98% of all courses are falling into the accelerated 8 week model. You can have the same number of times in class, but you can't bend the laws of space and time, right? You can't read twice as many books in a week when you're in an 8 week course. So my number one piece of advice is you have to schedule your time. You have to schedule the work that you're going to do in this class. You have to treat it like a part-time job. You have to say on Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, at this time, I'm going to do the readings. Or on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I'm going to set aside this block of time in the morning to do some reading and this block of time in the afternoon to do some reading. You have to schedule your work. You cannot just squeeze in reading and expect to get the most out of it, um, and be really genuinely successful in that way. You cannot expect to squeeze in all of your reading on Sunday after 4 p.m. to get it all done before Monday starts. It's not going to work that way. You might be able to quote unquote read it in that time, but you're not really going to be able to think about it and deeply process it. So treat this like a part-time job and schedule yourself. They generally recommend that for every hour that you're in the classroom, that you're scheduling 1 to 2 hours outside of classroom. This is a 3 credit course, which would then typically be 3 hours a week, but it's an accelerated 8 week course, so that's 6 hours a week. So that means you're looking at somewhere between 6 and 12 hours of work a week. I don't know that you would need all the way to 12 because you're not going to be studying for exams or anything like that. But I would take a look at your week and I try to schedule out 6 hours a week that you're going to be working on a course like this. Some days maybe you're going to have a little more because you're going to do discussion stuff on that day. Or other days you might need, or other weeks you might need a little more than six because you might not read it all in the time that you have given yourself. But try to schedule out time and don't put it all on one day. All right. My second piece of advice is use the secondary sources that have been provided to you. So every text that we're reading in this class, with the exception of like, you know, I think one thing that I'm going to give you that is on a PDF that I kind of put together. It's one poem that you're probably going to really recognize because it's also the national anthem. All of the readings in this class come with prefatory material in the anthology. In that prefatory material, your editor talks about the author and talks about the author's context in which the author was producing the work. This is incredibly important because in these prefatory lead-ins to the literary selections, your anthology editors are signaling to you the types of things that you should be on the lookout for as you're doing your reading. Sometimes they even provide a super quick plot summary. There will be some texts in this course where I will also give you a plot summary. I have weekly overview essays that produce ideas that I want you to keep a lookout for when you're in the actual readings. And I've also produced contextual essays for you that will help you get a more a deeper and more complex and nuanced review of the history that's going on in the time of the United States. As you know more about that, the work itself becomes more illuminated. So don't sleep on the secondary sources. They're not just bonus things to read. They really will make the process of reading the literature much easier for you. All right. The third piece of advice that I have for you is related to attitude. And I think this is a good piece of advice then for all students when they're in courses. I was once working with a student in a tutoring lab who said, I just don't understand why my professor is making me do this. And I was like, well, respectfully, let me try to turn your perspective around a little bit. You're not being made to do anything, right? You're choosing to do this. This course that you are taking, this degree that you are pursuing, this time in higher education, this is not something that you are being made to do. Even if there was a requirement that you sign up for, you still had a choice in whether you wanted to pursue this degree or if you're being forced to take college classes. I mean, you could, in a sense, make a different choice, right? If you were told you have to get a part-time, you have to get a full-time job, or you have to go to college, and you're like, well, I want to go to college. You're not being forced to do that. You've chosen that. The attitude twist that I constantly recommend that people keep in mind is to ask not why is my professor making me do this, and not even why did I choose this, but instead, what might the professor have wanted me to get out of this? That's a very subtle but profound shift in how you talk to yourself about the work that you're doing. Not everything you read in this class has to be your favorite, right? And there are plenty of things in this class that the first time I read them when I was a college student, maybe I wasn't super thrilled about them. But over time and through the course of my college degrees, I began to understand the importance of the text. And I began to understand why I was being asked to read the work. And so shifting your mindset from why am I being forced to do this to what might the professor have wanted me to get out of this is a small but profound way that you can change your mind from defensiveness and frustration and animosity toward open-mindedness, curiosity, and a willing to try to learn and grow. So it's an attitude perspective around keeping an open mind, and that's what's really going to help you uh, develop that strong attitude. All right. My fourth piece of advice is move your phone. Put it somewhere else from where you were reading. Put it on the other side of the room. Turn the mute on. You can set a timer for the time, but don't read with it next to you. Or if you are going to read with it next to you, have it be further than your arm can reach. Turn off your notifications, turn it face down. If you aren't feeling, or if you're adding a little bit of friction between you and the device, it makes it easier not to engage in it. You don't have to do 100% willpower at that point. There's a concept called the phone foyer method, right? And the idea behind this, which is just an alliterative idea, but you could literally take it and plug it in your bedroom and do your reading somewhere else. Plug it in on the other side of the room, face down, with your notifications turned off, and then sit at a table and do your work. There are ways that you can provide a little bit of friction and distance from your device, and that's going to be really useful in helping you build up those stronger reading skills. My last piece of advice is maybe the most challenging of all of the pieces of advice that I have given so far. And it's a challenge because of the particular nature of this course. I love teaching this course, and I really love teaching this course online because I get to work with so many students who I wouldn't normally work with. As you know, Ivy Tech is a statewide community college system, so when we offer online courses, students from all over the state are enrolled in the course. In any given course, I might have a student from Northwest Indiana, from outside Cincinnati, somebody from Indianapolis, someone from Evansville, someone from my home campus. I get to meet a lot of really great students who I wouldn't normally work with. And that's a real treat. And it's also an honor and a responsibility that I take seriously. So when I say my advice is try to move off your computer to do your reading, I realize the challenge there, right? This is an online course. Everything has to be built into the computer. It's where you do your work. And I have built in assignments into the online class because the reality is I can't tell you to do all of your work off the computer and then somehow figure out how to submit it in the computer. There are ways to do this, but at the very least, right, take advantage of the fact that a lot of screen, a lot of what's going on the screen can serve as a distraction. So try to close out things, close out all tabs and all applications that you don't need while you are engaged in your work. Minimize your distractions. Turn off your notifications on your screen if at all possible. Put your notifications into a focus mode or a do not disturb mode. Almost all devices now have something like this that you can put during the time that you are trying to do your reading. You need to hit that groove, and you can't hit that groove if your attention is constantly being pulled in multiple directions. If you can get yourself a physical copy of our book, I realize that that might be cost prohibitive to some people. So there are PDFs loaded into the class. You can print those PDFs. That should cost much less than going out and buying the book. And then there are other options that are available to you for how to sit down and do the reading. The short answer is our brains read things on the screen differently. You know this, I think, intuitively. Open up any article or any piece of news or any front page of a website and think about the way that your eyes jump around. They don't read the words in order and follow the lines all the way through like they were if you were reading a book. Our brains have become used to reading things on the screen in a different way. So because of that, it's getting harder and harder to do deep focus on a screen unless you are really trying to go out of your way and minimizing everything that's behind it and really kind of focusing. That's one of the reasons why we have these reading engagement assignments in the class, because I recognize that involves labor and you deserve compensation through course credit and points for the labor of engaging with the texts in this class. So print things or try to find a physical copy of the anthology, or at the very least, put your reading in full screen mode and close everything else out behind it. That can help you stay a little focused. Okay, at this point, I want to switch over now, and I thought maybe what we would do is do a reading together. And this is from our anthology. It's excerpts from William Bradford's Of Plymouth Plantation. I've begun to do some annotations on this, and I want to actually read the literature together. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move into full screen mode now. Uh, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what I have annotated here and some of the important ideas that I want to draw attention to before we get to the actual literature itself. So, in this introduction provided through the Norton Anthology, the editors tell you that Bradford seeks to portray the early days of the Pilgrims living in British North America as providential, definitely uncertain and definitely ambiguous, but ultimately providential, right? That's this main idea here, main idea here in the text. I'm gonna hit refresh on this. I've closed my laptop and circled out. Um, One of the great things about Canvas, though, is that when you annotate the first time, you go through and you can return to your annotations and everything will be saved. So I've had this open for a day or so, and now I can come in and I can continue doing my annotation work on the screen, right? So I have a combination here. When I engage in annotations on my readings, I have two primary strategies. I guess three if you count the comments, but that's kind of built into the idea of annotating. I have two primary strategies that I use when I go through and do annotations. And you can develop your own. I like things kind of simple and minimalistic. Some students produce, absolutely beautiful, like rainbow colored annotations, and they use an Apple Pencil or some other stylus to write on things. Um, you can see that down here with an annotate function, and you can add things. This is for my sorry, this is for my my Zoom. The annotation function in Canvas is up here at the top, and you can select from highlighting or from boxes that you want to put in place. Um, I like yellow highlights and I like blue boxes. Yellow and blue, I think, work really well in terms of annotations. They pop on the page. And for my eyes, they pop on the page. Not everybody's going to agree with me on that, but those are the things that I like. I like highlighting for the most part when I'm highlighting just a couple of, maybe two lines at the most, or a word that I want to draw attention to. I like boxes on top of highlights if I really want to draw my attention to a main idea, something that I can bring into the reading journals or something that I can bring in to written reflections about the things that I'm writing. And I really will use boxes as well as sort of a stand-in for annotations if there's like a long passage that I'm trying to draw attention to. Rather than highlight the whole thing, I'll just put a big box around it and then put a comment on the side. When you annotate or draw a box on the text, and like I said, I do both. And then I layer them on top of each other if I think something is really, really important. When you annotate, or I'm sorry, when you highlight or draw a box, both times you have an option to add a comment. It like defaults that way. And I think that's a really nice reminder that there's something about this that you're drawing attention to. And you should be having this nice mix of marking on the page and comments that build on that. Sometimes my comments are things like, it's important, right? Important. Bradford and other pilgrims saw their success as a measure of their religious devotion and whether they understood God's will correctly. That's the idea that's being shared here. And I'm rephrasing it, I'm paraphrasing it in the margin off to the side because I'm trying to remind myself this is important. As I start to read this, I need to keep this idea in mind. Often, these editorial introductions will explain why the work is so important. Once I understand that, as I read, I can start to wrap my brain around it. So I'm going to come now to the actual literature itself. I went ahead and annotated and highlighted the opening of the text, but I'm now going to actually do some real-time annotation with you so you can see me going along. And I'm going to read Bradford's text as I do so. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so that you can see this a little better on the screen, on your screen. And I'm going to switch over now to my highlight mode and I'm going to start reading. This is an excerpt of Bradford. Now, remember, when you're reading excerpts, you have to say to yourself, I might not know exactly what I'm jumping into because it's an excerpt, but use the prefatory information, use whatever was provided for you in the class, and as you start to get moving, you're going to be able to follow along. And another reason that I selected the Bradford reading is, students over the years have told me it's not one of the most exciting readings. Sometimes when I ask students which readings would you drop from the class, a lot of students say they'd drop the Bradford reading. That makes me sad, but I picked it as the sample annotated text so that you could get exposed to it through this example video, and at least walk away with understanding a little bit more about who Bradford was. So this is an excerpt from chapter 4, showing the reasons and causes of their removal. This is the there here in the title. There, Bradford is part of the Pilgrims, so this is who the there is, right? And we would know this if we read the prefatory material on Bradford that talks about Bradford being part of the Pilgrims. After they had lived in this city about some 11 or 12 years, which is the more observable being the whole time of that famous truce between that state and the Spaniards, and sundry of them were taken away by death, and many others began to be well stricken in years. The grave mistress experience, having taught them many things, those prudent governors with sundry of their sagest members began both deeply to apprehend their present dangers and wisely to foresee the future and think of timely remedy. Now, there are probably a couple of moments from this sentence that are a little, rocky for you, right? After they had lived in this what city, right? What do we mean that famous truce between that state and the Spaniards? Uh, What's going on here? Well, this is where the footnotes at the bottom of the page can serve as a really great resource for you. So, footnote 5 is down here in the lower right corner of the page. It says the struggle for independence by provinces of the Netherlands, a Protestant country, against Spain, a Catholic country, was interrupted by a 12-year truce that began on March 30th, 1609. This truce was now coming to a close. And this city refers to the Dutch city of Leyden. So, from the introduction, we know that uh, the Pilgrims were part of a group of separatists who did not see um, the Church of England as an appropriate vehicle for Protestant religion. And they did not think that the Church of England, that a king should be overruling the church in the nation of England. And so they left England first for the Netherlands, where they lived for a few years, but it was not necessarily friendly in the Netherlands. And as the truce between the Netherlands and Spain and a war that they were fighting was coming to a close, now these individuals needed to figure out a new place to go. And they're going to end up going to North America as a result of that. In the agitation of their thoughts and much discourse of things hereabout, at length they began to incline to this conclusion of removal to some other place, not out of any newfangledness, or other such like giddy humor by which men are oftentimes transported to their great hurt and danger, but for sundry weighty and solid reasons, some of the chief of which I will here briefly touch. And first, they saw and found by experience the hardness of the place and country to be such, as few in comparison would come to them, and fewer that would bide it out and continue with them. For many that came to them, and many more that desired to be with them, could not endure the great labor and hard fare, with other inconveniences with which they underwent and were contented with. But though they loved their persons, approved their cause, and honored their sufferings, yet they left them as they were weeping, as Orpah did her mother-in-law Naomi, or as the Romans did Cato at Unica, who desired to be excused and borne with, though they could not all be Catos. For many, though they desired to enjoy the ordinances of God in their purity and the liberty of the gospel with them, yet, alas, they admitted of bondage, with danger of conscience, rather than to endure these hardships. Yea, some preferred and chose the prisons in England, rather than this liberty in Holland, with their afflictions. But it was thought that if a better and easier place of living could be had, it would draw many and take away these discouragements. Yea, their pastor would often say, as many of those who both wrote and preached now against them, if they were in a place where they might have liberty and live comfortably, they would then practice as they did. So at the end of the paragraph, right, I've had to read, I'm trying to get oriented into the text. As I'm reading, it's not entirely clear what I'm reading. And so I'm not necessarily annotating line by line in real time. But now that I've come to the end of the paragraph, I have a couple of thoughts that I might want to circle back to and just make notes on, right? First, Bradford says, frankly, the situation was tough, right? A reason to leave. The situation was either inhospitable slash tough for the Puritans to endure. Right. He talks about how there's a lot of tension, that some of them would have been prisoned in England rather, on charges of treason for, daring to push back against the Church of England. They would prefer that than the liberty of Holland because even though they were free in Holland, there was still this idea that they were things were really tough, that they weren't entirely welcome, right? liberty with afflictions, right? So they're free, but not really free. And so what they decide is if there was some place we could go to have liberty and live comfortably, then we might want to go there, right? If there were a place where they might have liberty and live comfortably, then they would practice as they did, right? Important, Bradford is saying they want a place to live freely and to also and practice their religion freely. Okay. Now, one other thing that I noticed in this paragraph is there's a reference to Orpah and Naomi and also the Romans in Cato, right? And I noticed this because, well, first of all, it's just hard not to notice it, but there's also a footnote that's drawing me down to the bottom of the page. Let's go to the bottom of the page. Ancient Roman statesman, that would be Cato, of unbending integrity who committed suicide after being defeated in battle by the future Emperor Julius Caesar. Orpah was the sister-in-law of Ruth, who did not leave their mother-in-law. And they lifted up their voice and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth claved unto her. Right? And so as yet they left them as it were weeping, as Orpah did to her mother-in-law Naomi, or as the Romans did Cato at Unica. So what Bradford is suggesting here is he's drawing a comparison between the suffering of Naomi and the suffering of Cato with the experience of the pilgrims. So he's drawing an analogy or comparison between a biblical suffering, in this case, Naomi from the book of Ruth in the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament as it's known, and a classical example of suffering, which would be Cato and the pilgrims and their lack of freedom and their suffering under English rule. So, comparisons are really important. If an author is trying to make a comparison, he's making an argument, and that's what Bradford is doing. Just as you might have sympathy for Naomi or sympathy for Cato, you should have sympathy for us, right? Even though back home, and even though the Dutch, you know, seem to appreciate us, they love us, they approve of our cause, they honor our suffering, right? But yet they kind of turned a blind eye. And he's picking two powerful examples, right? That emphasize this. All right. Secondly, they saw that though the people generally bore all these difficulties very cheerfully and with resolute courage, being in the best and strength of their years, yet old age began to steal on many of them, and their great and continual labors, with other crosses and sorrows, hasten it before the time. So, as it was not only probably thought, but apparently seen, that within a few years more they would be in danger to scatter by necessities pressing them and sink, or I'm sorry, or sink under their burdens, or both. Okay, this is a really long sentence, and as I'm in the middle of reading it out loud and following along, something happened outside, light flashed on the inside, my mind was momentarily distracted, and so as is sometimes the case, I get to the end of a sentence and I didn't quite understand what I was reading. So I'm going to go back up to the start of the sentence and I'm going to read it again to make sure that I really understand what I'm reading. They saw that though the people generally bore all these difficulties very cheerfully and with resolute courage, being in the best and strength of their years. Okay, the they here is the people of Leiden, of the Netherlands, and the people here are the pilgrims. They generally bore all these difficulties very cheerfully and with resolute courage, being in the best and strength of your years. Yet old age began to steal on many of them, right? So they were living abroad, they were getting older, they were getting sick, and their great and continual labors with other crosses and sorrows, right? Notice the symbol here, the cross has been introduced, other crosses and sorrows. So here we have an echo of the crucifixion, hastened it before the time. So essentially, the stress and the burden and the labor of living abroad in a situation that wasn't 100% hospitable was starting to wear on people. It was something that they were carrying around. It was a burden. And it actually, though some of them were older, maybe they died before their time because of this. So, as it was not only probably thought, but apparently seen, that within a few years, more of them would be in danger to scatter by necessities pressing them or sink under their burdens or both. In short, Bradford is saying here that because living abroad is causing all of this stress to befall them, it's unclear how much longer they have before they're either going to scatter, the group's going to break apart, or all of the stress and the burden is going to kill all of them. So time is of the essence, right? We got tick tock, tick tock, tick tock. Right? And therefore, according to the divine proverb, that a wise man seeth the plague when it cometh, and hideth himself, Proverbs 22:3. So they, like skillful and beaten soldiers, were fearful, either to be entrapped or surrounded by their enemies, so as they should neither be able to fight nor fly, and therefore thought it better to dislodge betimes to some place of better advantage and less danger, if any such could be found. So we have divine proverb. Now, earlier in the prefatory reading, this is an example of what the editors say in the introduction that the pilgrims saw their mission as a divine command or divinely blessed, right? Bradford is writing from the future to this moment, right? He's looking back on this moment. He's engaging in a little bit of, I'm going to tell you how it was through my perspective. And with time, this is how I understand it. He's looking back on it and trying to make sense of it. And he sees in the way that they're feeling a biblical reference and literally cites a biblical passage from the book of Proverbs. So basically says, just like the wise people of the book of Proverbs, we are acting this way. So there's a direct connection between what the English pilgrims are thinking and feeling and a biblical precedent. Thirdly, as necessity was a taskmaster over them, so they were forced to be such, not only to their servants, but in a sort to their dearest children. The which, as it did not little wound the tender hearts of many a loving father and mother, so it produced likewise sundry sad and sorrowful effects. For many of their children that were of the best dispositions and gracious inclinations, having learned to bear the yoke of their youth, and being willing to bear part of their parents' burden, were oftentimes so oppressed with their heavy labors that though their minds were free and willing, yet their bodies bowed under the weight of the same, and became decrepit in their early youth, the vigor of nature being consumed in the very bud, as it were. But that which was more lamentable, and of all sorrows most heavy to be borne, was that many of their children, by these occasions and the great licentiousness of youth in that country, and the manifold temptations of the place, were drawn away by evil examples into extravagant and dangerous courses, getting the reins off their necks and parting from their parents. Some became soldiers, others took upon them far voyages by sea, and others some worse courses, tending to dissoluteness and the danger of their souls, to the great grief of their parents and dishonor of God. So they saw their posterity would be in danger to degenerate and be corrupted. Okay, so the third reason that Bradford offers for why the Pilgrims want to leave the Netherlands for somewhere else, right, is the effect on the children. This is a classic rhetorical maneuver, right? Think of the children. We have to do it for the children. The children are at risk. The children are in danger, right? And sometimes that works for some things and sometimes it doesn't work. But oftentimes, some of the big changes that happen, the big social changes, the most radical changes that happen are often done in the name of protecting the children. And there are two things that are kind of going on here in this example, right? The first thing is that, look, there's a reference here to the Book of Lamentations. And Bradford is saying, look, it's not a bad thing to work. It's not a bad thing to have chores. It's not a bad thing to carry a burden, but it is bad when it becomes so much that it's starting to like break down a child's body, right? So here we have this idea that although their minds were free and willing, yet their bodies bowed under the weight of the same and became decrepit in their early youth, the vigor of nature being consumed in the very bud, as it were. So, um, responsibility and burdens, or I guess yoke is the word that uh, Bradford was borrowing from the Book of Lamentations. Burdens aren't necessarily bad, but they're having a negative effect on children. And I might even take in this moment as I'm thinking here, right? When we talk about their dearest children, right? Classic rhetorical move, right? Think of the children. That's the kind of I mean, look, I'm recording this video, so I'm trying to like record it in a very professional way. But when you annotate, you're welcome to kind of share whatever candid and frank thoughts that you have. You might be like, "Oh, this is a BS argument," if you want, and you can be even more direct than that if you would like. But for the sake of kind of walking through and demonstrating in real time, right? This is a classic rhetorical move. Think of the children. And that even won't somebody please think of the children? That's a Simpsons reference from my youth that I think about and draw on whenever that comes up. But like, here's the other thing, right? Here's the other thing that Bradford's talking about, and it's worth noting, right? While they're living in the Netherlands, the children are being corrupted. It's not just by the world of the Netherlands around them, right? They're being corrupted. The Netherlands even has that reputation today. It's not just, like this is kind of interesting in the sense that like even in the early 1600s it has this reputation. But the Netherlands was well known as sort of like not quite as religious as the other countries of Europe. Even today the Netherlands, also called Holland, the area of the Dutch. That's where Amsterdam is. Amsterdam was one of the first cities that had like cannabis cafes. The red light district, where prostitution is legalized and regulated, is in Amsterdam. So, like, there's a reputation over there. And Bradford's kind of like the Pilgrims were also like, I mean, look, we were welcomed here because they're a welcoming people, but they're also like a welcoming people, if you know what I mean. And it's a little much for us. And so there's a corruption of the world around. Lastly, And which was not least, he says, a great hope and inward zeal they had for laying some good foundation, or at least to make some way thereunto, for the propagating and advancing the gospel of the kingdom of Christ in those remote parts of the world. Yea, though they should be but an even as stepping stones unto others for the performing of so great a work, right? So he says last but not least, and I think this is probably ultimately, first in their list of concerns, being as religiously devout as they had a great hope and an inward zeal that they would spread the gospel of Christ, right? They see this as a missionary opportunity. They want to come across, they want to build what John Winthrop calls the city on a hill, a shining example that the rest of the world is going to be looking at, right? So these and some other reasons moved them to undertake this resolution of their removal. So in this case, removal now, the Netherlands are not removing them, they are removing themselves. So we can see how the grammar of that is working now, the which they afterward prosecuted with so great difficulties as by the sequel will appear. Now, difficulties is going to be one of those like super important words in Bradford, right? It's going to be so important that I'm going to make an annotation here, right? Emphasis on the difficulties of their journey to North America. And I'm not only going to make a highlight on that, I'm also going to draw a box around it, right? It's a really important concept thematically for Bradford. It was not easy. The introduction to this reading talks about how their land grant was for Virginia, but with the ocean, they got blown north and they land in Massachusetts, where the winters are so much harsher and they weren't really prepared for it. They went through a lot of trials and tribulations and struggles once they got to the New World. And I want you to notice in this next passage how Bradford uses literary and figurative language to tell the story. And when I get to the end of this particular excerpt, although there's a little more here that we could read, um, I want to talk a little bit about some of the literary language, and we're going to pull this to a close for this particular example. I think I've kind of demonstrated the annotation process enough. It's also gone a lot longer than it would if I was just doing it in real time because I'm talking through my thoughts and I'm reading it out loud, which is keeping me going slowly. You read slower out loud than your eyes do when you're reading, but you also read more deeply when you're like focusing on every single word that's in front of you. So, you gotta weigh one, six of one, half dozen of the other. The place they had thoughts on was some of those vast and unpeopled countries of America. Now, look, um, really? Unpeopled, right? Um, there were people, vast, yes, especially compared to the size of Europe, but unpeopled, not so much, right? But notice it's the adjective that Bradford is offering up. The vast and unpeopled, maybe what he means here is, non-European peopled countries of America, which are fruitful and fit for habitation, being devoid of all civil inhabitants, right? Again, we have this emphasis here, civil inhabitants, right? Notice Bradford's rhetoric. It's not like there are already cities, he's saying, or at least the people who live there don't necessarily count in his calculation, right? Where there were only savage and brutish men, which range up and down little otherwise than the wild beasts of the same. So, whoa, right? One might say in an annotation, whoa, comparison of the Native Americans to wild beasts, right? Yikes. It's kind of uncomfortable in terms of the rhetoric, but you know what? We noticed it. It's something that we can draw attention to when it comes to annotations. This proposition being made public and coming to the scanning of all, it raised many variable opinions amongst men and caused many fears and doubts amongst themselves. Some, for their reasons and hopes conceived, labored to stir up and encourage the rest to undertake and prosecute the same. Others, again, out of their fears, objected against it and sought to divert from it, alleging many things, but those neither unreasonable nor unprobable, as that it was a great design and subject to many unconceivable perils and dangers. So we don't have unanimity here, right? It says it raised many variable opinions. So might make an observation here. There's not unanimity that this is a great idea. There's a lot of fear and anxiety too, right? Some people are really all in on it. Some people are like, whoa, this is like we're going to get on a ship and we're going to cross the ocean and we're going to go live somewhere that like we might not ever be able to come back from. That's a pretty big deal if it doesn't work out. So let's go back to where we were, neither unreasonable nor unprobable, as that it was a great design and subject to many unconceivable perils and dangers, as besides the casualties of the sea, which none can be freed from, the length of the voyage was such as the weak bodies of women and other persons worn out with age and travail, as many of them were, could never be able to endure. So one of the concerns is the journey across the ocean might be too much for somebody weak of health or too old to be able to endure. Yet if they should, the miseries of the land, which they should be exposed to, would be too hard to be borne, and likely some or all of them together to consume and utterly to ruinate them. For there they would be liable to famine and nakedness and the want, in a manner of all things, the change of air, diet, and drinking water would infect their bodies with sore sicknesses and grievous diseases. And also those which should escape or overcome these difficulties should yet be in continual danger of the savage people, who were cruel, barbarous, and most treacherous, being most furious in their rage and merciless where they overcome, not being content only to kill and take away life, but delight to torment men in the most bloody manner that may be, flaying some alive with the shells of fishes, cutting off the members and joints of others by piecemeal, and broiling on the coals, eating the collops of their flesh, collops here meaning slices or portions, in their sight whilst they live, while other cruelties horrible to be related. And surely it could not be thought, but the very hearing of those things could not but move the very bowels of men to grate within them, and make the weak to quake and tremble. This is a lot, right? Like if you were reading this for class, you might be like, whoa, Bradford's going hard here, right? But I think that's really important, right? This whole passage we could probably put just a single comment on. Like Bradford is really laying it on thick about the perceived risks of removing from the Netherlands to North America. He's using a lot of adjectives and incredibly vivid imagery to demonstrate fears that the pilgrims had. Right. And I think part of what he's trying to do here is he's really trying to be like, he's really trying to set the stakes super high. He's really trying to make it seem like, whoa, This is really, really, really risky. But also, in doing so, it's not a backhanded compliment. It's a pretty front-facing compliment, right? The fact that they did it makes it all the more remarkable, right? So I think this is kind of like he's like using some marketing language here. He's really making the situation. I'm not downplaying the danger of the situation, right? Ships get lost at sea, storms come, there's a lot of risk there. You don't know what the other land's going to be like. Is there going to be food? Are we going to get diseases? Are we going to be able to survive? If somebody's too old and frail, are they going to die when they get there? What about mental? I mean, they would necessarily be thinking about mental health, but from our own perspective, we might be thinking about mental health. It can be really traumatic to have to go through this. And there's a lot of fear mongering about the interactions that they're going to have with the Native Americans when they arrive, right? Word has gotten back to England, hey, there's this place you could go. There are no cities, but there are run-ins with people who are different from us, and who knows the degree of accuracy of these accounts, right? But there's a lot of fear there. It was further objected that it would require greater sums of money to furnish such a voyage and fit them with necessities than their consumed estates would amount to. Yet they must as well look to be seconded with supplies as presently to be transported. Also, many precedents of ill success and lamentable miseries befallen others in the like designs were easy to be found and not forgotten to be alleged. Besides their own experience and their former troubles and hardships and their removal into Holland, and how hard a thing it was for them to live in that strange place, though it was a neighbor country and a civil and rich commonwealth. So, look, I mean, I think this is an interesting point that Bradford's making, and it's certainly worth highlighting and thinking about, right? Look, leaving England for Holland wasn't easy, and that was just going to a neighboring country that was a lot like our own, right? It's drawing a comparison. So again, um, immigrating to Holland was difficult. Um, so there's a genuine worry that it's going to be even harder. Great. Because it's so different, right? So think about how Bradford's laying it on really thick here. He's really raising the stakes. He's really making this seem like an existential crisis. So then how do we resolve this? It was answered that all great and honorable actions are accompanied with great difficulties, and must be both enterprised and overcome with answerable courages. It was granted that dangers were great, but not desperate. The difficulties were many, but not invincible. For though there were many of them likely, yet they were not certain. It might be sundry of the things feared might never befall. Others by provident care and the use of good means might in the great measure be prevented. All of them, through the help of God, by fortitude and patience, might either be borne or overcome, right? And so I think this is the rhetorical move that Bradford is really building toward. He's making the world seem so scary, but the reply is yes, but with the help of God, we can do it, right? And so the strength of God is made so much stronger and more powerful than the danger that lies ahead. Or, I mean, maybe the possible danger, probable danger, it's not entirely clear, right? This is what Bradford's trying to say. Look, what brought us to America? Things were rough in Holland. And frankly, they weren't much better for us in England. And we are really scared of what it would be like, but yet we're going to overcome that fear because we believe so strongly that God will protect us. Right? True it was that such attempts were not to be made and undertaken without good ground and reason. Right? They have a good reason for why they're doing this, they think. Not rashly or lightly, as many have done, for curious or hope of gain. I'm sorry, for curiosity or hope of gain, right? So he's drawing a comparison here. For curiosity or hope of gain, he's making a comparison. The pilgrim's mission is not mere curiosity, like exploring, right? And not pure hope for gain, like profit or economic exploitation, right? But providential, stemming from the will of God, as they see it and understand it. But their condition was not ordinary, their ends were good and honorable, their calling lawful and urgent, and therefore they might expect the blessing of God in their proceeding. Yea, though they should lose their lives in this action, yet might they have comfort in the same, and their endeavors would be honorable. They lived here, but as men in exile, and in a poor condition, and as great miseries might possibly befall them in this place, for the 12 years the truce were now out, and there was nothing but the beating of drums and preparing for war, and events whereof are always uncertain. So look, it's a risk if they stay, it's a risk if they leave. The Spaniard might prove as cruel as the savages of America, and the famine and pestilence as sore here as there, and the liberty less to look out for remedy. After many other particular things answered and alleged on both sides, it was fully concluded by the major part to put this design into execution and to prosecute it to the best means they could. So, one final thought here. Bradford's pretty clear. You know, strong anti-Native American bias in this text. And part of this was informed, I think, the fact that this was not written before they left, but written 10 years after the arrival, when there had been a lot of tensions, a lot of, you know, collaboration too, but a lot of tensions. The tension and the violence and the fear and the mistrust is a strong part of the story from the very beginning. This has been my attempt to, go through and annotate a passage from Bradford in real time so you can see how I did it, hear my thoughts as I read, and also try to give you like a mini lesson on Bradford and the Pilgrims and where it all comes from. Uh, this video has been on the long side, I know, and I'm of course going to say that when I post it to the class, and it's also going to be noted in the video description and with some timestamps, and you can jump around if you want. But the point of the video was to walk you through some annotations in real time, not just show you how the annotations work, but actually walk you through some annotations in real time to give you a sense of, in a slowed down explanatory way, how I annotate when I'm going through a text, the kinds of things that I'm looking for, the kinds of things that I make observations and draw connections to. As I see these things in the text, I can then transform these things into topics that I might want to talk about on the discussion board. So this was put in place so that you would be able to see it and follow along. You do not have to read and annotate Bradford, but I wanted to make sure that you learned a little bit about William Bradford and the Pilgrims and what brought them and how on of Plymouth Plantation was written, and how Bradford is using his unique perspective to tell the story of why the Pilgrims left and how they arrived. It's one of many perspectives on that story, but it's one that's become very famous. and therefore is a key part of American literature before 1865. Thanks for watching if you made it all the way to the end. I hope this video was helpful. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me.